Good afternoon and welcome, everybody. I'm Ann Francke, the Chief Executive of the CMI, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this edition of our Leading Lights interviews in honor of CMI's 75th anniversary. Now, today is very special because I happen to have the CFO of Royal Mail, and I'm delighted to bring you and welcome Angela Noon at noon. Hello, Angela.
Good afternoon, Anne. Delighted to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Well, it's great to see you, and I know this is a new role for you, and actually, congratulations on being there are, I think, around 15 CFOs in the FTSE 100, and you are joining that august group, so that's amazing. And of course, before you were at Siemens, and the CFO there for the UK and the executive director. So a great career. And let's get started. Now, my first question is, what role do you think that values and ethics and culture play in professional management? Are they important? We have things like P&O ferries going on at the moment. What do you think about that and the role of values, and how does it manifest in your everyday approach?
Thank you, Anne. I mean, one of the reasons I actually joined Royal Mail was because of its social purpose. That trust at the doorstep. I think it's an incredible legacy, but actually so important, I think, for companies today that they have a role to play in society. And as you talk about ethics and values and giving something back, I think it's essential. And it's essential through your supply chain. For example, people want to know if they buy a pair of jeans, has a child been exploited in preparing and producing those jeans? And I could go on, but it's got to be in the middle of everything we try to do as business. And I think more and more investors are taking this really seriously. They're interested in how sustainable we are, how we treat the planet, how we treat people in terms of equality. And what our real strengths and values are, what the culture is within our companies. So I think it's very, very important.
Yeah, that's great, and getting even more so. Now, you've had a great career, as we've highlighted. What are some of the challenges that you face that you think people starting out in their careers will still face today? And what have you learned that might help them overcome them?
I mean, one thing that I still face today is navigation of politics and people. And at the end of the day, organizations are great webs of people's values, people's behavior and character. And I think it doesn't matter how experienced you are as a leader or a manager, learning how to get the best out of your own team, but also influencing your network and the stakeholders around you continues to be a challenge that I have every day of my life. Yeah, and I'm using all the skills that I've grown over years, but people are very different and situations are different. So yeah, that's definitely one.
Yeah, well, stakeholder management is important, and it's perhaps getting more important. But okay, that's a perennial challenge. What about new challenges, maybe challenges that you didn't face that you see emerging for new managers and leaders?
Well, certainly new normal is bringing out challenges for leadership style. So I think if I go back to when I first became a young manager and trying to learn better engagement and getting the best out of the skill set within the team, I think when you try to do that remotely, that is, for new managers, that is a massive mountain to climb. You're trying to develop yourself and your own leadership style, and actually you're doing that over a screen or virtually. I think that is very different to when you and I started. Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right. And we've done a lot of research into this at CMI, and we know that over 60% of managers and leaders haven't been trained on how to manage remote teams. And, when you've got to do performance reviews remotely, you've got to motivate people remotely, it can be tough going. I mean, do you have any Any tips for people facing those challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think this remote working and also new normal, it's highlighting the managers that have the better and higher EQ skills. Yeah.
Mhm.
And because you've got to be able to connect with people. And I think those days of sort of stand and command, you've got away with that in the office. Now, I would say the real tips are you need to really bring on those listening skills. So we always knew were very, very important, but I think much more important today. You've got to have regular touch points throughout the day, speaking to your teams and making sure that there is an understanding of deliverables and what your expectations are, because I think that we don't realize that, you know, inadvertently our body language in an office, when we're near to each other, we're constantly sending signals as humans where you can see that when you're in close proximity, okay, my boss isn't happy, or I didn't meet expectations, or I haven't done. I think over a screen, it becomes so much more important that you are regularly checking in, that your team understand what you're trying to achieve. So my big tip is just keep communicating. I know that sounds really cliched, but even now, more than ever, the communication skills are really at the top of the list.
Well, you know, you're right, Angela. When we did some research, Management Transformed, we did over the pandemic, and we asked people, what are the most important skills? And actually, you know, the number one skill was exactly as you said, it was communication. And that, as well as a new emerging concern for managers and leaders around well-being, right? Because that's getting at this managing remotely and connecting with people. So those are some real challenges that aren't getting any easier, and that are still so vital to getting the best out of people. So you're
I love that
absolutely right.
I love that you mentioned mental health, Anne, because I know you've covered this in several publications as well, from the CMI, and a lot of your webinars touched on it through the pandemic. I still believe that connectivity, human to human, is so important, and I do think that touch point again with employees, making sure that they're feeling okay and asking them how they're feeling. There are people that are working quite well in this environment and are flourishing, but there are others, I think, that are struggling. And you need to be mindful that you don't know what someone is going through. There's also a lot of people who are carers at home now that we didn't have previously. And there's a huge burden on society. And I think it's important that we recognize we've got a responsibility.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Now, you've joined a very well-known institution, the Royal Mail, and obviously you've referenced its purpose. But of course, all institutions need to balance continuity with the ever increasing pace of change. Now, how, in your view, do institutions best balance out the tension between, you know, keeping the past and embracing the future?
I mean, I always like to think that every company should run a little bit like Formula One. So there's the current race that you've got to have the team on and you want to win. But then there's the next race. So Formula One teams are already preparing themselves, especially with innovation and change and new ideas. And I'm a great believer of putting small, agile groups onto those innovative thoughts, and that how do we make ourselves better? How do we up performance? And maybe even really disruptive stuff. I mean, I've put a lot of specialist ideas together that look, you know, let's just get around and bench and brainstorm, you know, what we could do if we had a clear sheet of paper. And I think by doing that, you separate the business as usual team, which of course typically has high targets, you know, very performance related. There's engagement with the board, expectation, and then you've obviously got constant comparables to your competition. So I think you do need to separate those things out. So I'm a great believer in not sort of blending everything. I think first then you confuse the people. You can derail stability. And I think you need to embrace the change, look at disruptive ideas, give people some space to think outside the box, and dare I say, fail fast. Because a lot of these things are, you could get 100 ideas and 2 of them actually have legs. Trying to understand the difference between a science project and a decent business case, let those guys get on with it. Don't try and muddle it all together. That's probably what I would say.
Okay, so you believe that you have a team out in front looking at the future, and then you have the team, as you put it, doing the current race and trying to win that. So you separate, so you have 2 separate teams, is basically what you're saying.
Well, that's what I've liked. I've really enjoyed doing that in the past. It doesn't take the pressure away from the business as usual. We're still expecting those managers to, outperform competition, to think about new ideas and really drive their own businesses. But we should never, ever step away from the future. We've got to lean into the future.
Yeah.
And that sometimes needs time and dedicated resource that are thinking a little bit differently.
Yeah, it's a very fair point. And if I think about back in my corporate days, for example, at P&G, we did exactly that. We had upstream groups worrying about the future, and then we had those on the ground trying to win in the present, if you like. So, it is a formula that can certainly work.
And I think you need to be careful, especially if you're number 1 and number 2 in your market, that you don't get complacent. I mean, we all know the history of companies that have sort of rested in their laurels and then suddenly have been disrupted from somewhere. Apple's a great example of that if we look back in history. So I think it's important that you keep your eye on the prize and also don't close yourself off just because you are number 1 or number 2. There is changing market coming from everywhere. There's new competition. There are startups coming in. Very, very important that you don't have a closed mindset as a leader.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think, I forget what the stat is, but something like only less than a third of the FTSE 350 were around, I think it's 50 or 100 years ago. So, right. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. You do have to keep your eye on things if you want to, be sustainable into the future. Well, another thing that's really important, perhaps, that contributes to maybe better decisions and maybe greater sustainability is having more inclusive management and leadership teams. I mean, how do you now, as a FTSE 100 CFO, how are you making sure, and how do we make sure that we have many more women in leadership positions? And what do you think needs to happen to influence that?
There's a lot of behavioral topics in that, and maybe I just link it back to the last section where we talked about innovation. You know better than me, you probably have the stats in front of you because you always talk about it, is, when you have a diverse group of individuals, you get better outcomes, you get better decisions, and you get to kick the tires around from a different perspective. And that can only be good for companies. And especially if you are able to think outside the box. I also believe that there's evidence to suggest that profits actually increase, if you read some of the literature. So how do we kind of make sure we bring those diverse teams together? And you mentioned gender. I mean, I think it starts in the recruitment phase as well, that, one of the things we were very clear on in Siemens is that we had a diverse slate when we were approaching vacancies, especially also in the junior management all the way up, but also filling the pipeline of entry-level talent. So, typically we had graduates who were, male, white, from an engineering background, actually from some of the best universities in the country. And as we progress, we've actually said, no, we need to balance this. Let's look for more female graduate engineers. Let's look at BAME candidates. let's have a look at people who have from different social backgrounds and maybe didn't go to Oxford. Yeah. And I think that diversity of slate in your recruitment processes is essential
Yeah.
before you start. And I think then the next thing is to address behavioural topics in the company. I mean, as we've discussed before, how the company has a culture of allowing and embracing diversity is for me one of the things I'm still trying to figure out. Yeah, I haven't got it. I'm not perfect. We're not perfect. It's still early days in Royal Mail, but what I've saw is some great initiatives in Royal Mail and some really sort of, sort of new thoughts and different ways to engage the employees. But I do think it starts in recruitment, but also behaviour. And I think that no tolerance culture is very, very important. So if we see a female being badly bullied or made a fool of, or is even just feeling uncomfortable because she's being asked to bring, I don't know, the tea in or do the minutes and meetings constantly, that is another form of harassment. Yeah. And I think we've got to call it out. And I think as leaders, we've got a responsibility to say, we don't tolerate this. And that has to come from the top. It has to be part of a company's culture.
So there's a lot in your points there. I want to go back on a couple of them. So first, starting with calling it out. By the way, I agree with you, but I know that there are people that are going to say, but okay, how do I do that? I mean, you said start from the top, and I'm sure if you call it out as CFO, people will listen to you. But what about people in middle management that want to call out these bad behaviors? What advice would you give to them?
Yeah, I mean, this is probably a big experience I had in Siemens is, we had to really tackle also through questionnaires and employee feedback, those hubs of behaviors. I mean, very quickly you see a pattern across the country where there's clearly a culture of unacceptable behavior. And so calling it out also starts with the leaders actually moving those individuals out of the organization and also talking with them about the behavior. But I think allowing, if somebody feels that they are being badly treated because of ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, whatever, there's got to be an environment that they feel that they can open up. So this speak up culture is very important. And I think in Siemens, we've actually introduced a network of sponsors and sort of almost like first aiders, for want of a better word, where the people can actually go and feel safe to have a conversation about how they're being treated, with the understanding that the management will follow up on it.
That's great. That's very important. And I know other organizations have used that, these kind of, safe, as you say, safe, like mental health officers, or where
Yes.
you can go and say, I feel I'm being bullied or harassed without fear of repercussion, which is really important. But the other thing that you touched on that I want to come back to is, you said, of course, it's important to fill the pipeline, but you also mentioned how important it is to progression, right? So making sure that you're keeping your eye on who's getting promoted. Are you promoting proportionately? Are you keeping hold of that diversity? Is that something that you've taken a look at in the past, or what are your thoughts on doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've actually just recently in Siemens put targets into the executive management level on balance of gender in particular. So we've actually made it part of our incentive structure. Because it's the only way to sort of address also this unconscious bias that does exist in every organization. So those are the sorts of things we're doing to make sure that we are getting people into the right positions. We've got a bit of work to do on things like disability. Where we don't have a high proportion of disabled people in the company, which is something we've tried to change. But really trying to get a balance on ethnicity as well in certain functions actually is what we started with. And I think it's important if you are incentivizing management, then they start to take the topic much more seriously.
Yeah, right. Make it part of the performance review, right? Because it's
Okay.
part of performance. So
Sure.
that's a pretty simple thought. But you touched on something else about making people feel comfortable addressing these things, and we know that many managers just don't feel comfortable talking about race or disability for fear they'll get it wrong or say something wrong. How do we help people gain more confidence, more fluency in talking about some of these things?
Yeah, and I have to put my hand up here, Anne, and also say that, I was brought up in sort of working class Glasgow, and we all have our little suitcase of values, etc., that we carry about all through life. And I was very lucky that I actually went to school with a lot of Black people, actually, and I have a lot of Indian friends as well. So I felt very, very, very comfortable in I'm a person that doesn't see a difference in color. Yeah. And I was quite surprised when I came down south and met people from a different background, how uncomfortable they actually are. And it's not racism. It's exactly what you say. It's they don't want to offend, and they don't know how to engage using appropriate language, etc. And the only thing I can say is it's a long journey, especially if you come from a white, pale, male, stale environment. What we've been doing is just holding a lot of seminars. We've got a lot of groups in the company to bring people together, with sponsorship, which is also diverse. Uh,
Mhm.
and I see that Royal Mail are doing some very similar initiatives. And then they're using Workplace, which is basically an employer led Facebook, to talk to the organization about the different things that are going on in different groups. And I think it's really bringing the level of understanding up.
That's great. So what you're saying is it's kind of like the calling it out. It's about making these stories of what people are experiencing a part of the workplace culture. So bringing it to light, sharing it so that people
Exactly.
get more comfortable. And that's how we get more comfortable. And I know that your own background is really interesting. Like what about your journey? Have you ever felt that you were maybe looked at differently because you came from a working class background in Glasgow than some of your peers? And how did you manage that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say for a very long time. I think until I moved to Germany, you always have this, especially in the earlier parts of my life. I have a dialect. Nobody in my family went to university. I come from a pretty bad part of Glasgow. I was actually in the social care system as a young person. Um, and there was a point in my life where I think, I could have ended up as, some of the people in my community, which were in effect neat. Yeah.
Mhm.
So, without any training, no job, and basically unemployed. So I think coming from that and growing from that, of course, you get a lot of discrimination. Um,
Mhm.
but I think it's made me a better leader, and
Mhm.
especially if I think about something like Royal Mail. I've been getting around the company, and I think if you've got your feet on the ground and you are talking to people from all different backgrounds across the United Kingdom, and a lot of them unskilled or semi-skilled, and you've lived with that, I think you find a connection. There is an awareness of what these people are living with, and what their environment is. So I think it's really helped.
So it makes you it's that EQ that you mentioned earlier on that you have innately because you've lived through that and you know what they're going through. It's empathy, it's emotional intelligence, and the ability to connect. That's what you're saying that your own background has helped you with.
Absolutely, and I think I loved what you said about stories
Mhm.
when we talked about discrimination. I think it's because you're right, it's so powerful in understanding how another person is feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's no different to me talking to a post woman or man that is delivering posts in a very poor part of United Kingdom. It's that understanding of how they're feeling, and I think those stories that you're talking about in terms of discrimination inside an organization are equally powerful. You're connecting people, aren't you?
Yeah, and I think it's really important. And we're looking at that for our 75th. We just put out our first video on ethnicity in the workplace. And, you know, the opening is people sharing their stories, right? And it
Yeah.
is somebody saying, you know, in an office of 300 people, I was the only Black woman who wasn't a cleaner. And, you know, that's the opening to the video. And you think, wow, you know, imagine that. So you really can see this is what this person is actually dealing with, right?
Yeah.
And so I think listening to that and being more aware of that is, as you say, incredibly important. And you were able to do that growing up, as you said, because that's you were surrounded by a lot of people who were struggling. And I'm sure that does make you a better leader. Well, one of the things that we're really battling with, not battling with, but constantly trying to get views on and understand when we look at the different characteristics, right? We have, you know, socioeconomic background, gender, age, ethnicity, disability. Do you think that it's best that we look at these when we're trying to overcome and become more inclusive? Should we look at each of these areas separately, or should we combine them all? How do you think you get the best outcome? What's your view on, you know, do we treat them separately? Do we put them all together? What's the best way of making a difference?
Yeah, I mean, my personal view is to put them all together, and it's not because they're not important individually in their own right, but I think it's back to, you know, I'm a CFO. If you're not measuring it, you're not managing it. So I'm a big fan of also getting the data out in terms of these groups, and we see this already with government agencies, etc., that started many years ago. But I think within organizations, we need to start understanding the demographic, and also start to measure the pull through across time. For example, with recruitment all the way through personal development, management, leadership, whatever. I think that this has to be looked at as just part of our everyday existence as a company. It's no different to checking. We used to check people's ages years ago. I mean, I'm sitting having conversations in Royal Mail about the age demographic. I just see this as a data point that will allow management to make the right decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it allows you to also adjust your policies. And I think also it's a great thing to gather also complaints. Yeah, because as we just talked about, it's not always working perfectly and people don't feel valued because of culture. So data also allows us to pull out, you know, back up to perhaps a complaint. But I think the big thing for me is to really use it to drive change.
Mm-hmm.
Put
Mm-hmm.
the mirror up to the organization and say, do you know, this is how we are, how our demographic is in these areas, and what are we going to do about it?
So I think you're raising a really good point, and I think we're finding this out in a lot of the work that we're doing, where for this project, our 75th project, where people are saying, well, of course we have gender policies, ethnicity policies, age policies, whatever. But and of course it's equal opportunity. But then when you look at the metrics, the data, as you say, it's
Yeah.
not. It's kind of like that bot that came about for International Women's Day, that every time a company went out in favor of equal opportunity for women, this bot tweeted their gender pay gap, right? So it was like, well, you're saying this, but in actual fact, in your own organization, the pay gap is that. So there's a gap between the word and the deed. And of course, data helps you confront that, doesn't it?
It does, and I actually think when companies were publishing their gap data, there were some companies you kind of took a sharp intake of breath and thought, wow, didn't know that, especially in financial services, yeah. And so it's not just a mirror to the organization, it's a mirror to society, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really important thing. So more data. I agree with you. We have to measure. It's, as you said, what gets measured gets managed, and obviously, what gets managed gets done. Or if you're not managing it, expecting it to get done is pretty unrealistic, right?
Yeah, and I think we're all going to be held accountable on this stuff in the future. I think this generation, I always forget which generation we're on, Y, Z, but they are not tolerating this anymore. Yeah, and I think the more transparent we are as organisations, which unfortunately does require data, I think that we start to look that we are trying to move the needle and that we are forward thinking. And I think it also helps, shareholders to look at what type of company is this, and actually they care about these things.
Yeah. And you mentioned that earlier on, that you think increasingly shareholders are caring about, the sustainability, how you treat people, the social accountability of companies, and indeed their governance. And we've seen that recently, haven't we, with this recent example I mentioned at the outset of when you do something that people, consider and not upholding those values, as happened recently with the whole P&O Ferries incident, there's a big backlash, right?
Yes.
So I think you're right that it is becoming more important, and more people are more willing to call it out. Now, we touched earlier on some of the things that had changed in the pandemic. And I wanted to come back to that. What have you personally learned from the pandemic about your own leadership style? And maybe what do you think we've collectively learned as businesses and society about the importance of management?
I unfortunately was one of those leaders that really wanted to see presence in an office. My style is very balanced. I like to think of myself as a people leader, but I must admit, I think I'd been trained over time that I needed the people near me, and because I love to engage with people, yeah, and I love working directly with my team. I really struggled with that. I didn't think it could work. I was very critical of it. And I also didn't trust. I didn't trust the people that they were actually, still able to keep up the level of productivity. And of course, fast forward 2 years, I have completely changed my mindsets around, yeah. And that is, if I self-reflect for a minute, I was thinking, why are things so different? And I think it's because it's been proven to me now that we can still go on and we can still deliver. But I was incredibly skeptical 2 years ago. So I guess I've learned about my leadership style is I don't have to control the obvious stuff.
I think it's a really important point that you've admitted that, and that thank you for being so brave, because you are so not alone. There were many, many, many leaders who felt exactly the same way. This could never be done remotely. If my team's not in a place where I can see them, I don't know what they're doing, and I'm not sure I can trust what they're going to be out, the output. And for you to say, gee, I was proven wrong on that, and now I've completely changed my mind, I think is a really powerful thing. And I thank you for admitting that. And did you share that with your team? Did you say, gee, I've changed my view?
I did. And I actually saw some sighs of relief on camera, because I think for a while there was always this sort of, does she think I should be in the office? So there was, when things started to open up again and lockdown was lifted, I think there was a period where they were thinking, okay, she's wanting me back in the office now. So I think when I openly admitted that I'd got comfort, I think everybody was like, oh, thank goodness. Yeah. So that is something I definitely struggled with. In terms of, Anne, your other question about what did we learn as a society, as about the importance of management. I mean, the big learning for me, and I guess it's probably linked to my CFO position, is we are constantly talking in business about risk management and the risks to our bottom line and our revenue. So very, very focused on our performance. And I've sat in so many risk management workshops where we've talked about things like a pandemic, or even climate change, or dare I say, a war. And you can see that people had difficulty digesting it. Yeah. So we would sit there in risk management workshops say, that will never happen. So it was always laughed out of the room and put aside, and never ever appeared on our enterprise risk management discussion at board level. And I guess what I've learned from this pandemic, I think society has learned about leadership and management, is that we need to also accept that to, keep an eye on the performance. We are now living in such uncertainty unprecedented. And I'm now I can't believe that I was 2 years ago talking about a pandemic that I couldn't digest. And now I'm talking about a war in Ukraine across my supply chain. Yeah. And I'm also now talking about climate change. And I know many of my old customers, like British American Tobacco, talking about climate change in forests and things like that. And I guess the whole thing we've learned as leadership and management is we are living in a different era now. And you can't close your eyes to what we think could be low probability. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. So, it really is a highly uncertain world. And I guess what we've learned is we need to anticipate that and really be very agile. And it's interesting what you say about the pandemic, because my previous chair, Bruce Carnegie Brown, is chair of Lloyd's, and he was saying that pandemic has actually been number 2 on the Lloyd's mega list of, mega risks for a long time, but nobody ever took it seriously. And here we are, right? So you're right. It is, we do need to learn how to be agile, but let me test you now as a CFO. One chairman said to me that the one thing that all of this uncertainty has meant for him is that he doesn't use the word forecast anymore. Because you can't forecast more than 3 weeks out, let alone 3 years. Now, you're a CFO. What do you make of that? What does it do to forecasting this uncertainty?
Well, unfortunately, I will never accept that you can't forecast. I'm one of these annoying CFOs that thinks, give me some management judgment. But I can understand the point, because you do get your base forecast now, but then what's really, really odd that I haven't saw in my whole career is under that forecast is a long list of risk and uncertainty. And to manage that now as a CFO or even a CEO, you're trying to find opportunity constantly to offset these headwinds. And we haven't talked about the macro impact, the economical impact. We've just heard about inflation again this morning. And I think, this is just, it's a crazy time, and you will get it wrong. But we've got to give an outlook, but very, very difficult. I would agree with your colleague there.
Yeah, no, it is very difficult. And I guess it just means that you have to have more contingencies, more alternate scenarios, and be ready to shift quickly, right? To respond to things that maybe you thought might not happen, but here they are, and we're living in them. So yeah, I guess better agility. Is that something that you think that we've learned?
I think you're spot on. And I don't think every company can move quickly. Some companies, certainly I'm very early on in Royal Mail, but the ability to transform and be agile is not in the culture. Yeah. So, and I think that most companies are in that position. I don't think that's unusual. I think we haven't had to experience that before, have we?
So it's something that we're always learning, and indeed, it's not a lesson that we can ever stop learning, I don't think. But you mentioned earlier when we were talking about progression, the importance of sponsorship and mentoring. What about your own experience with sponsorship and mentoring, both for your career, helping you, and now that you are in a leadership position, how you help others? Can you give us some insight there?
I've actually been incredibly lucky. I mean, I feel very, very blessed. I probably wouldn't be sitting here now if it wasn't for some of the sponsors that I've had. I had some great mentors as well, but I think until I truly got high level sponsorship, that's when things really started to, it was a game changer.
Mm-hmm.
And I have one particular sponsor who actually had been my boss at one point, and he moved up the organization fairly quickly. And in his later part of his career, he started to sponsor me more actively. And I think the great experience of it is the difference there is it's not just sitting down and having a coffee and talking about, what you're trying to achieve and maybe some hurdles that you're having. It's really that person making a broadcast across the organization that they believe in you, that they believe in what you're capable of, and that they are, banging the drum to make sure you get the next step, the next step, the next step. And I've just been incredibly lucky to have someone like that. And I think it's important that that person is also respected in the organization and has clout to make sure that people understand that if there's another vacancy coming up, that this person should be considered, and here's why. And I think that's one topic. And I think the second thing is you learn from a much higher level executive how to behave. And what was great with him is he was very candid with me about, if you want to survive at the top, these are the things, you need to draw your neck in here, and here. Yeah. So, because we do go through this change, don't we? Where you've gone from being an executor, a very good executor, great people manager, and suddenly you're in the world of vision, strategy, risk management, if you just performance, but the great world of influence. Yeah. And suddenly you need to change your style. And maybe before you were on the attack as an executor, now you've got to learn those softer skills and those persuasive skills. And I think getting that sponsorship at the top with somebody that is been there and is actually watching you grow, but is able to give you constructive feedback, was a huge learning for me.
Yeah, it's a great example, and I love your phrase, banging the drum for you across the organization. And I think you're absolutely right. That's what sponsors do, right? They stick their neck out for you, right?
They do.
Even though once you're in a senior position, you're not supposed to stick your neck out so much. But sponsors do stick their necks out for people, and it's great that you had that. And I'm sure that you sponsor others. Now that you're in this
position. I really try and pay it back, Anne. And I think you're spot on about sticking the neck out, because you see a lot of people that want to be mentors. But the minute you are putting your own reputation on the line for someone else, it's quite interesting how you see some people's behavior change. So they step back and say, yeah, I was happy to be the mentor, but I'm not able to get myself over that line of really sort of speaking on behalf of this person and putting my rubber stamp on. It's amazing how many people can't do it. Yeah. And I have to say, very openly for all the listeners, I am also very, very careful about who I sponsor. Of course I am. My own reputation's on the line. But I think it can be hugely beneficial for individuals, for the right individual. And I really try and pay it forward.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to be in a sponsorship culture. Is one really important aspect of an inclusive culture, right? Where you're actually sponsoring a lot of different talented people who don't look like you, who deserve that sponsorship and deserve that advocacy. So I want to just, before we take questions, and by the way, we will be taking questions. So if you have a question for Angela, let us know and we'll get to those in a moment. But I have to ask you a couple of big questions now. So what would a better, fairer society look like to you?
Well, I mean, given my background that we just talked about, I am hugely passionate about education, and it really started when I left university. I used to take time out to teach people to read and write, and I've did a lot of community stuff over the years, because I have actually saw some of these people who, they can't actually apply for benefits because they don't know how to read or write, and this is just, for me, I find it actually quite upsetting. Yeah. So I think for me, a fairer society is, when you talk to me about that, it's a lot to do with skills.
Yeah.
And I find it quite hard to believe the amount of kids in this country that are still living in poverty. We saw this over the pandemic. There were children who didn't have access to, a device or a laptop, so they were unable to be schooled. You've got issues with people who are coming into adulthood that don't have essential skills to live. So I really believe on everyone should have access to learning.
Yeah.
And I think that means also it translates into better performing schools and keeping teachers safe and making sure that we understand that we've got a huge responsibility also as business, because these are the people we're going to be recruiting in the future, to make sure that every child has equal opportunity.
Yeah, it's great. And you chair, don't you, the UK government's Productivity and Skills Council?
I do.
And that's, I guess, a manifestation of how important that is to you. And what is your message? What would you like the government to do if you could wave a wand as chair of that commission?
I mean, my putting the skills aside, I think the big thing for me is, what is it that the United Kingdom and Ireland is brilliant at? And we see a lot of countries. I lived in Germany for 10 years. Where you talk about Germany, people think automatically engineering, or you talk about Switzerland, you immediately think pharmaceutical. Yeah, I think we've got to work out what we're really good at. We've lost a lot of our manufacturing capability, for example, and you remember our car, our automotive sector is decimated. So for me, that skills of the future topic is very important. So what are the skills so the future of work? What does it look like for the UK? How do we take the demographic of people we've got now? If I think about my own company or companies I've been in the past, is those people are going to need upskilled, because we're talking about the fourth industrial revolution, where we're now going more digital. Well, a lot of workforces just simply are not digital natives and never have been. There's a business needs to invest to get there. And so I think I'm waiting for the government to set its stall out. We've talked about levelling up, but levelling up has to link to a country strategy and future skills strategy, and how we recover from the pandemic, but more importantly, how we make ourselves great.
Yeah, no, you're very right. These things are all interrelated, and whatever those skills, also digital skills, technology skills, we always need to have the human skills to go along with them, right?
Absolutely.
Going back to your earlier point, if you don't have those human skills, it's very, very difficult to get the best out of people. And on that note, what is it that you think, what's the difference that managers and leaders make, in your own words, in maybe helping to make the UK great?
Well, I think we need to get government closer to business, don't we? I think listening to the voice of business, and I've been involved with the CBI before, is critical in terms of listening to the evolving trends. So, for example, we're now seeing huge startup activity in London. Yeah, so a lot of cybersecurity, a lot of technology, and so I think it's knitting that together and saying, actually, we've got capability here in the United Kingdom. We're seeing massive digital skills appearing in the north of the country, in Manchester. So it's that engagement with business to say, okay, what is coming down the line? What are we losing? Because there's actually areas that are totally disrupted. And then I think building on that to say these are the focus areas for the UK, and these are the things we're going to be known for in the next 5 years, and actually put some investment behind it.
Right. Great point. And on that subject, your first question comes from a subject of investment, that is. This is from Serenity. Serenity in Leadership. Okay, that's how they're calling themselves. So Serenity asks, I spend my time persuading CEOs and CFOs to invest in D&I beyond a tick box effort. The typical response is, quote, we don't have the budget, unquote. As a CFO, what would your advice be to fellow CFOs who resist?
Well, I obviously I don't have the name for this question, but I have to put my hand up and say I was one of those CFOs many years ago, where I was cutting budgets on this topic. Unfortunately, it is a normal behaviour when things are going south that you start on the little buckets of functional cost. I've again totally changed my view in the last few years. What we did in the past in Siemens is we actually set aside a very dedicated sum of money, and it was actually funded by all the divisions. And what you do with that is you get skin in the game as well, that people agree up front that they want to contribute and be part of this change and this initiative. So I think moving away from just getting it as a sort of middle, a central level basket is so important, because it will be the first thing that gets hacked. Yeah. So you've got to get it owned at business unit division level. So that, I think that's the first thing. And the second thing is, I think that business case behind it, which is also what we started to look at, and I know that Ann's team has referred to, is that diversity breeds performance. And I think getting that data in front of decision makers and making sure that people are armed with, some sources of information that support a long-term D&I strategy. And I think the last thing is the cultural piece. Another thing that wakes up CEOs quite quickly is that reminding them that a new generation is not going to accept this, or shareholders are not, investors are not going to accept this. I think if you can put the economical side onto the cultural piece, that usually does the trick.
Great. Well, great advice there. Thank you for that. Next question is from Pete. As a middle manager, how can I help tackle unconscious bias within my organization? I see it on a daily basis in my working life, but there seems to be no awareness across the organization it's even happening.
Pete, first of all, I'm sorry you're going through that. It sounds to me, I don't know which organization you're in, but it sounds like they don't have the mechanisms to capture that. And dare I say, it sounds like you don't feel comfortable enough to go to your immediate line manager with it. So it sounds like there's a lot of cultural topics going on in there. I would still urge you to speak again to your line manager and try and explain how you're feeling. I think when you bring out the feeling stuff, that usually, certainly if you're like me and you have a lot of EQ, if you just touch the point on this is how I'm feeling rather than the factual, this is what happened. I would also go to HR with it, if it's become that serious, and engage an HR partner. And I think last but not least, you can also be a thought leader for this in your organization. I don't know which level you're at, but to start getting momentum and forming a group around the topics you're trying to handle there, and also get attention of, and take that momentum to a higher level.
Yeah, that's some great advice, because if Pete got other managers that were feeling similar to him,
Exactly.
and you got your stories together, right? We're back to that stories point. and you collected some of those stories and took it to, the CEO, right?
Yes.
Or the leadership team of your division or whatever. It's about, because you can't deny people's feelings. I think that's why you're saying how you feel is so important, because nobody can tell you to deny your feelings, right?
No.
People, might have different versions of the facts or not be aware of the impact of their behavior on how it makes you feel, but nobody can deny you how it makes you feel. So some
That's
really good
right.
advice.
That's right.
The next question is from Stella. What do you feel is the best way to gain feedback on your management leadership style from your peers?
Well, I mean, maybe again, I've just been very lucky in that I've did lots of 360-degree feedback in my organization, and I actually enjoy it. In fact, I encourage it because it helps me self-check myself. And when I do it, I usually do my immediate team and the other some of my stakeholders and upper management, but a lot of it is actually my peer group. Because it's important that it's back again to this influence. Your peers are actually a huge influence on also your reputation and also how you get things done in the company. So it's important that you know how they're feeling about you. So this would be my first port of call in terms of getting, that sort of data. And then once I got that, I would start approaching people directly and saying, look, this is what I saw through this 360-degree feedback. Is that your experience of me? Especially the areas that you have to improve. And I would make it a very balanced conversation and say, well, it's great to hear that I'm doing this, this, and this very positively. But I was interested to hear what is your feedback. And then you get verbal feedback. You'll usually find the verbal is softer than the other feedback, but it's so great for self-development.
Mm-hmm. And, could you maybe share with Stella, is there something that your peer group told you needed to perhaps get a bit better on that you took to heart and improved?
Yeah, I mean, I had a 360-degree feedback about 12 years ago that was actually quite life-changing for me. I was going through a massive transformation in a company. It was really a construction site. It was part of a profit warning for the entire group. Very, very serious. It was hemorrhaging 100 million. And I did my usual, which is anybody that's did Myers-Briggs or anything. But when I'm under stress, I go into execution mode and I'm very focused and I have a clear plan of action. And I just really I'm like a machine. Yeah. And the problem with that is you're not engaging your community because you are so narrow-minded on the goal. And people start to get a bit alienated because they see you going at 100 miles an hour. Because, of course, I was doing things that were affecting my peers. And I got this feedback, and it was absolutely dreadful. Not just from my peers, but also from my team, because, there were the change agents that loved it and loved working that way. But there were people that were like, she's like a train coming into the station and she's lost all her carriages. Yeah. So I did have this kind of, I did have this moment of self-reflection and thought, okay, I need to do something here. So yeah, I definitely have had that.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that, because it obviously just makes you more human. Last quick question from Estelle. With the shift to predominantly online meetings, what are your top tips for ensuring everybody is present and engaged?
Well, at the moment, everybody's turning up because I'm new.
Well, Andrew, the CFO,
Everybody's turning up and engaged. Well, I have a couple of things where I actually try and make sure I'm presentable on a camera. Because I think if you look sloppy, then people think the meeting's going to be sloppy. And there was a bit of that in the pandemic, people turning up without being shaved, they're sitting in the jogging boot. And I think this is a start of people are not really going to be excited about what you're about to say. I think I don't want to be old fashioned, but I do think how you look is important. The second thing is, I think clear purpose and agenda and getting some online feedback before you come in. And then the other thing is really that touch point of, you know, a well-being check-in. I do that a lot, actually, sort of taking the first 5 minutes and just say, you know, how is everybody feeling? And you'll find that people relax quite quickly, and then the level of engagement is a lot higher. Yeah. But yeah, those are things I do to get people to feel a lot more comfortable.
Well, those are great tips, Angela. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's been awesome as ever. Congratulations again on your new appointment and on sharing your story with us. And if you've enjoyed listening to Angela at noon in this edition of the 75th anniversary CMI Leading Lights series, please do consider joining us at CMI. You can find out how to do so in the chat. Thanks again, Angela. Great to speak with you as always.
Lovely, Anne. Thank you for having me.